Funding for this program was provided in part by BYU Religious Education and the Religious Studies Center. This Sidney B. Sperry Symposium address by Dr. Richard Neitzel Holzapfel was given on October 28, 2006.
Today we're going to be talking about the topic is the Da Vinci Code, the Gospel of Judas, and other bad ideas. The present discussion, of course, is going to be short and sweet. There's no pretense that I've provided a complete discussion of the topics under consideration, but nevertheless, I think it's important to review some important issues that are being discussed in and outside the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints regarding the world of the New Testament and the early Christian church. Jesus Christ, the New Testament, and the history of the early Christian church are headline news, as these magazines published this year indicate. All over the world, whether you're in Buenos Aires, Argentina, or Athens, Greece, or Rome, Italy, Jesus made the cover of books and magazines and newspapers during the spring of 2006. While there are many misconceptions about the past, particularly relating to the New Testament and the history of the early church and the life and teachings of Jesus Christ, this headline news stories actually is all good news. It provides us, committed disciples of Jesus Christ, an opportunity to talk to family and friends, to business associates, those we meet along the way, because this is now an open discussion. Just 10 years ago, it was always a sensitivity to talk about Jesus Christ and Christianity, particularly in public forums. Today, that has changed. But there are some bad ideas that I would like to highlight. First of all, the first bad idea I'd like to talk about today is we can learn something about Jesus Christ and early Christianity from the Da Vinci Code. 2, the Dead Sea Scrolls are proto-Mormon documents that can help us prove the church is true. 3, the Gospel of Judas and other Gnostic texts, for example, those found in the Nag Hammadi codices, provide insights into the life and ministry of Jesus Christ. 4, the New Testament Apocrypha contains the quote, plain and precious things removed from the Bible. The 16 King James Version is a new revelation of God and is superior to the original Hebrew and Greek text on which the translation was based. 6, the New Testament scholars are evil. They are atheists, agnostic at best, and they deserve to go you know where. Past LDS scholarship is the best scholarship. The Joseph Smith translation is only a footnote to the King James Version of the text. We'll examine each one of these briefly to talk about the implications. The first bad idea, of course, is the one we learn something about Jesus Christ and early Christianity from the Da Vinci Code. Surprisingly, according to certain polls, a number of people who have read the book claim they believed they had learned something about Jesus' ministry, about the New Testament itself, and about the early history of the church. As we talk about the Da Vinci Code, there's some things we should remember. First of all, the Da Vinci Code is a novel. The Da Vinci Code is found in the fiction section of bookstores. The author of the Da Vinci Code has no academic training that would suggest that he is an expert on the New Testament or early Christianity. And most importantly, the author of the Da Vinci Code is no apostle or prophet and therefore cannot provide prophetic insight to the past. Given that the book is found in the fiction section of the bookstores, we might rightfully ask, what is all the fuss about? We may appropriately respond, it is all about a statement printed in the introduction of the book, a claim by the author that has caused people to wonder what is fiction and what is fact in the novel. The author states, all descriptions of artwork, architecture, documents, and secret rituals in this novel are accurate. Because the statement by the author and the number of inquiries that regarding the historical accuracy of the context of the novel many scholars began talking and writing about the historical problems in the book right off the bat, and has become a separate industry. An attempt to provide answers to a hungry public who wants to separate the fiction from the facts. For our purposes today, we can identify only a few flagrant examples of the historical problems found in the book, problems that both liberal and conservative scholars agree are disturbingly inaccurate. They are the following. More than 80 gospel accounts were considered for the New Testament by the early church. Blatantly false. The New Testament canon was decided upon by a pagan Roman emperor, Constantine. Blatantly false. Jesus was not considered divine, but was viewed by his followers as a great and powerful man, but a man nevertheless, a mortal, until the Council of Nicaea in the 4th century. Blatantly false. The Dead Sea Scrolls were first discovered in the 1950s. He's off by a few years. The Catholic Church tried hard to suppress the release of the Nag Hammadi codices, these Gnostic texts discovered in Egypt in 1945. The Dead Sea Scrolls are the earliest Christian records. Mary Magdalene was from the house of Benjamin. Mary Magdalene was pregnant at the time of the crucifixion and was taken secretly to France by Jesus' trusted uncle, Joseph of Arimathea. Obviously, none of these are true, but this is the kind of material that is perpetuated throughout the entire book. And for those who have no training or have not had wide exposure to scholarly articles, conferences, and books, they might question whether or not these are true or false, particularly based on the author's contention that all of these things that provide the historical context for the obvious novel, which is fiction, are true. Bad idea number 2. The Dead Sea Scrolls are proto-Mormon documents and can help us prove the church is true. I remember as a young stake mission president in Southern California, we were meeting with the elders talking about the progress of converts. And there was one contact who had gone through all the lessons. And we talked to the missionaries, what can we do to help them move from the last discussion to a commitment to baptism? And both the elders smiled and said, well, this Thursday we have the DSS lesson. And I said, well, I'm not familiar with that. The Dead Sea Scroll lesson. I said, what do you mean the Dead Sea Scroll lesson? Oh, we have our lesson that will prove the church is true from the Dead Sea Scrolls. I got quite concerned. The Dead Sea Scrolls were first discovered in 1947. Eventually 11 caves through the next few years yielded a remarkable amount of material. More than 850 texts were found in the caves near Qumran, written in Aramaic and Hebrew, with a few in Greek, belonging to the Greek translation of the Bible, Septuagint, with minor variations. Most on leather. Former BYU professor Scott Woodward has identified gazelle, bovine, and ibex skins. But there were some written on metal, the famous copper scroll, now in the museum in Amman, Jordan. On the parchment and papyrus manuscripts, scribes wrote in black ink, with an exception of the Book of Numbers, in which several verses appear in red. A number of manuscripts were found in the caves that dotted the area from the northwest corner of the Dead Sea. Among these manuscripts are examples of every book from the book of Hebrew Scriptures, except Esther and many other texts, for example, including the Book of Enoch. Since their discovery, the content of the Dead Sea Scrolls have generated a lot of speculation. Exaggerated reports among the saints in unofficial publications, talks, firesides, articles, books, and even tapes and CDs have suggested that those who collected and copied these texts were proto-Mormons, even suggesting that many doctrines of the Restoration are to be found in these writings. Even some unwise members and missionaries have attempted to use the Dead Sea Scrolls to prove the church is true. Professor Dana Pike provides a thoughtful response to these reports. Let me now answer the question posed in the title of this paper. Is the plan of salvation attested in the Dead Sea Scrolls? From a Latter-day Saint perspective, the answer is definitely no. Dr. Pike's assessment should not surprise us given the historical context of the people who gathered at Qumran. First of all, those who collected and produced the Dead Sea Scrolls, like other Jews during this period, lived in a partial state of apostasy without prophetic leaders. 2, the community did not respond to Jesus' call to follow him. Certainly there may have been individuals, But because they did not respond to his call to follow him, they remained at Qumran and were destroyed, and the people were most likely killed by the Roman army during the Jewish war beginning in 66 AD. Nevertheless, the scrolls, well, let me just talk about some of the things that are not in it. First of all, this is what is not in the scrolls. A clear idea about the role of the Messiah ben David. In fact, it appears the people who gathered here believed in the coming of two Messiahs, Messiah ben David, Messiah ben Judah, the kingly Messiah. But they also believed in Messiah ben Aaron, someone who was a descendant of Aaron who would be anointed by God. Seems to be clear in their writings that they believed that the Messiah ben Aaron was a superior Messiah above the Davidic Messiah, which we obviously would reject. A belief in the Messiah was God's own Son, a belief in a personal Savior, a belief in the final redemptive sacrifice, a knowledge of eternal ordinances performed by Melchizedek priesthood authority, a knowledge of the degrees of glory and eternal progression. Without those elements, these texts remain hollow for one seeking salvation. Nevertheless, the scrolls are important. Again, Don Perry and Dana Pike, two of our experts on the Dead Sea Scrolls who have been invited to participate in the official publication effort, have said this: the scrolls, of course, do not contain the lost records we await that have been promised in the Book of Mormon and in the Doctrine and Covenants. But they do provide new information about the transmission of the Bible, the Hebrew and Aramaic languages, and the variety of beliefs and practices of some Jews in the late Second Temple period. So they are of great value, but only when we use them correctly. Today, all interested individuals can read the most important non-biblical texts from the Qumran in English for themselves, allowing themselves to discover what is in the scrolls and what are not. You do not need to rely on anyone else. Published in 2004, the revised edition of this very famous and absolutely classic collection is called The Complete Dead Sea Scrolls in English. Provides a readable and authoritative translation of the important non-biblical materials in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The next idea is that the Gospel of Judas, along with the Gnostic texts, provide insights to the life and ministry of Jesus. The Gospel of Judas got a lot of attention with its announcement. As you know, sensational media stories in the very midst of the Da Vinci Code phenomenon got the attention of the public when they heard that a new gospel had recently been found. With typical media hype, the National Geographic Society announced that it was about to publish the long-lost Gospel of Judas, known to have existed from sources in the 2nd century. The codex containing the Gospel of Judas dates to about 300 to 400. Was torn and crumbling before conservation work began. Today, the text has been carefully restored and published in English. Gay Strathern, a faculty member at BYU and a Gnostic expert, provides us with a succinct description of the text. The Gospel of Judas, she says, views Jesus and his mystery from a Gnostic perspective, a very different perspective from the one described in the canonical Gospels. Because the Gospel of Judas was written well after the canonical Gospels, we can assume that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John provide us the earliest and most reliable accounts of Jesus' last 24 hours. Like other Gnostic texts, the Gospel of Judas is simply too late to provide us any significant historical information about the first half of the 1st century. The Gospel of Judas, of course, fits well with a larger body of Gnostic texts. A significant collection of Gnostic texts was first discovered in Egypt in 1945, known today as the Nag Hammadi Library, because they were found in Nag Hammadi, Egypt. Dating from the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, these texts have captured the imagination of many scholars and Latter-day Saints. An authoritative translation of these Gnostic documents is found in James Robinson's book, The Nag Hammadi Library, first published in 1978, republished and updated in 1990. Again, providing lay interested people a chance to read the text in English for themselves to decide whether or not the Gnostic texts provide us insights about Jesus' life. Professor Strathern continues her cautious assessment of the Gnostic texts with this statement. Latter-day Saints, however, must be cautious. They must guard against any endeavor to study Gnostic writings with the purpose of identifying proof texts for their own doctrine. We have noted, for example, that the Gnostics had a very different understanding of the nature and purpose of mortal existence and the identity of God in the Old Testament. They believed that salvation was possible only for a select, predetermined group of people. In addition, their concept of, quote, temple marriage, end of quote, was a celibate union between individuals and either Christ or their own divine image. Any Gnostic teaching found in these writings must be understood within the context of the Gnostic Gospels. Let me make this one important statement. The Gnostic texts provide us nothing about the salvation given through Jesus Christ, through his suffering and death and resurrection in Judea 2,000 years ago. Therefore, they are completely bankrupt. It is important to remember the chronological context. Today we have copies of Matthew, Luke, and John, and Mark that date as early as maybe the AD 150. Some of them maybe as early as AD 125, meaning that these texts predate any other document relating to Jesus Christ, Nag Hammadi or any other Gnostic text. In some cases, we only have 30 or 40 years removed from the original in these early copies of the Gospels, making the New Testament not only the earliest documents about Jesus, but most likely the most reliable. That's the most important statement. If you want to know something about a battle in the Civil War, do you go find a soldier who participated in that war, who wrote down his memories of that war 10, 20, 30 years later? Or do you find somebody who wrote something 100 or 200 years later who didn't use sources from the Civil War? You obviously would use the primary sources of people who either talked to people who were there or people who were there themselves. The Gnostic texts are late. They rely on no eyewitnesses. They rely on no early texts. They're simply stories produced much later to provide the Gnostics a certain view of salvation that precluded Jesus' atoning death and sacrifice. The Apocrypha texts are, of course, the next bad idea. The New Testament Apocrypha, an undetermined number of books, contains the plain and precious things removed from the Bible. Like the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Gospel of Judas, and the Nag Hammadi texts, non-scholars can access the New Testament Apocrypha through English translations of the text, allowing anyone to read for himself or herself what these texts have to offer. These are important examples of English publications that contain these books. In contrast to the wild and exaggerated claim made by some people, there are voices of warning about the use and misuse of these texts. Professor Stephen Robinson, in a classic talk given years ago here on BYU campus, says this: to the degree to which the apocryphal literature proves that the Latter-day Saints are right or supports our beliefs has been greatly exaggerated in the unofficial literature of the church. And I believe those who make these exaggerated claims either do so in ignorance or else perpetuate a pious fraud. Some of the tapes and other material that circulate in the church on the subject are very misleading. I want to affirm, again giving the context, that these texts are important. I want to affirm the importance of the apocryphal literature for our understanding of biblical history, of biblical languages, a background of the biblical books themselves. There is much valuable information here for the Latter-day Saints if we understand the texts for what they really are and use them appropriately. It is not the use of this literature that is objectionable, but the misuse. Again, I think Dr. Robinson provides us a clear clue. The Nag Hammadi texts, the Gospel of Judas, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and these New Testament Apocrypha books did not come forth through God's appointed servants. And therefore, they are of a secondary nature. But nevertheless, to understand the world in which they came, these are essential. Any discovery from the past is good news because we find so little has survived. So when we find an ancient text, it's great news, and it tells us something about the people and the time that produced it, but not necessarily about the fullness of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Bad idea number 5. The King James Version, the 1611, is a new revelation from God and is superior to the original Hebrew and Greek text on which the translation was based. Succinctly said, some people believe that God inspired the translation of the King James Version in a way that if we found the original letter of Paul or the original Gospel of Mark, the King James would still be superior because it was a revelation from God, not simply the writing of ancient apostles and disciples. The King James Version of the Bible is known as the Authorized Version, was first published in 1611. This version has had immense influence. However, some people fail to realize that there are 5 different editions of the KJV. Obviously, the first one, 1611, 1629, 1638, 1762, and 1769. As a result, any dogmatic assertions about the 1611 edition must be tempered by the fact that the current KJV, used by most English-speaking readers, including members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, is actually based on the 1769 edition, not the 1611. In a really important and popular book dealing with this topic, God's Secretaries, let me read to you a couple quotes. The making of the King James Bible in the 7 years between his commissioning by James, King of England, in 1604, and his publication by Robert Baker, printer to the King's Most Excellent Majesty, in 1611, remains somewhat of a mystery. The men who did it, who pored over Greek and Hebrew texts, comparing accuracy and felicity of previous translation, arguing with each other over the finest details of chapter and verse, were many of them obscure at the time and are generally forgotten now. A gaggle of 50 or so black-gowned divines whose names are almost unknown, but whose words continue to resonate with us. They have a ghost presence in our lives, invisible but constantly heard, enriching the language with civility, learning, and eloquence of their translation, but nowadays only whispering the sentences in our ears. But the virtual anonymity is the power of the book. The translation these men made together can lay claim to be the greatest work in prose ever written in English. That it should be the creation of a committee of people no one has ever heard of and who were generally unknown at the time is the key to its grandeur. It is not the poetry of a single mind, nor the effusion of a single vision, nor even the product of a single moment, but the child of an entire culture stretching back to the great Jewish poets and storytellers of the Near Eastern Bronze Age. That sense of an entirely embraced and reimagined past is what fuels the book. During the past 50 years, strong feelings about the KJV have emerged, mostly in reaction to some modern-day translation efforts that some people believe de-emphasize the divinity of Jesus Christ and the Old Testament's ability to see beyond their own day. Let's examine 6 positions that are now held by various Christians about the KJV. First, some people prefer the KJV because the language speaks to them. 2, some people prefer the KJV because they believe the texts used for the Hebrew and Greek translation are superior to any other texts available to scholars. 3, some people believe God preserved those Hebrew and Greek texts used by the translators. Some people believe the KJV is an inspired translation. Some people hold that the KJV is a new revelation from God and that the translation is preferred even above the original text. And the most extreme position argues that the KJV existed in heaven before the creation of the world, and that Moses, Isaiah, Matthew, and Paul read the 1611 KJV in heaven and translated it here on earth. Kelly Ogden has said succinctly in the Encyclopedia of Mormonism, in various lands where the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has been established, it uses a translation of the Bible in the local language. In English-speaking areas, the church uses the King James Version or Authorized Version, mainly because it was the basic text used by the prophet Joseph Smith and because subsequent church leaders have approved its use. The church does not claim that the KJV is perfect, but is currently the preferred English version and was used in the church's 1979 edition and later printings of the Bible. I suppose you could find Latter-day Saints, active, committed disciples of Jesus, who would disagree on these points outlined. There would be some who simply prefer the KJV because of the language. It's familiar to them. They love it. It makes them feel good. They like it. And there would be others on the very extreme who believe that Paul read it in heaven. And the vast majority would be somewhere in the middle. There are some important contributions to the restoration with the KJV that we must acknowledge. Joseph Smith read from a KJV Bible in the spring of 1820, And that event led him to seek God in prayer, thereby opening a new dispensation. Joseph Smith read from the KJV Bible between 1830 and 33 during his work on the text of the JST, which blessed the church through increased understanding of God's plans. The KJV provides the language of the Restoration in English. It is the language of the Book of Mormon translation, it is the language of the Doctrine and Covenants, and it is the language of the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible. But as Kent Jackson has so adequately and powerfully demonstrated, Joseph Smith's effort with the Joseph Smith translation shows that he attempted to simplify and modernize the KJV. Most importantly, it is the language of prayer in the English-speaking church. The KJV will continue to play a significant role among English-speaking members of the church. However, it's important to remember some facts about the edition we currently use, as noted above. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints issued an LDS edition, the King James Version, in 1979. This edition is based on the 1769 edition, which contains significant differences from the original 1611 edition and is also slightly different from the one used by the prophet Joseph Smith and the majority of the early saints. Joseph Smith's Bible was also based on the 1769 Cambridge University Press edition, which was more or less identical to the current LDS edition, but with additional modernizations. There seems to have always been an attempt by Joseph Smith and early church leaders to make the King James language speak to a modern audience. The next bad idea: the New Testament scholars are evil, they are atheists, agnostic at best, and they deserve to go you know where. Certainly, just as we know of bad doctors, lawyers, and mechanics, we can identify New Testament scholars who question the reliability of the New Testament in reconstructing the life of Jesus of Nazareth. However, we would be unwise and unfair to categorize an entire group based on some individuals within that group. In fact, an increasing number of scholars are deeply committed disciples of Jesus Christ. Inside and outside the church, many stalwart scholars not only respond to critics of the New Testament, but also provide all who will listen and read thoughtful discussions regarding the life of one whom God had sent to save us and to save the cosmos is most heart-rending. We live in the best of times. There are more faithful, dedicated scholars living today than at any time who have the skills but also the testimony. Let's talk about Joseph Smith and his example. We know that Joseph Smith was called by the Lord to provide three important translations: the Book of Abraham, the Book of Mormon, and the Joseph Smith translation. His efforts in these regards might be better understood as an inspired translation because he did not learn any ancient languages to accomplish this task. But we sometimes forget that the prophet did not see his approach to studying the Word of God as an either-or proposition, either by faith or by study. Joseph did take time to follow the Lord's counsel to, quote, study and learn and become acquainted with all good books and with languages, tongues, and peoples. He studied ancient languages and modern languages in his efforts to understand the scriptures more. Joseph Smith mentioned this: attended the school and read and translated with my class as usual. My soul delights in reading the Word of God, the Word of the Lord, in the original. I am determined to pursue the study of languages until I should become a master of them, if I'm permitted to live long enough. On another occasion, he says, our latitude and longitude can be determined in the original Hebrew with far greater accuracy than the English version. You can see by this that, yes, he did study the scriptures by faith, and by faith he translated the Book of Mormon through an inspired translation, the Joseph Smith translation, and also the Book of Abraham. But he also studied the scriptures by using his mind, and he took the hard task of learning ancient languages. Recently, President Kimball at this campus gave this challenge to BYU faculty, including religious education faculty. Your double heritage and your dual concerns with the secular and the spiritual require you to be bilingual. As Latter-day Saint scholars, you must speak with authority and excellence to your professional colleagues in the language of scholarship. And you must also be literate in the language of spiritual things. We must be more bilingual in that sense to fulfill the promise in the 2nd century of BYU. Again, a prophet who didn't see an either-or. Either you do it by faith or you do it by study. That both the mind and the heart are required of God. The next bad idea is past LDS scholarship is the best LDS scholarship. An increasing number of Latter-day Saint scholars trained in various disciplines relating to the New Testament studies, ancient history, Greek, Latin, textual criticism, Roman civilization, and geography, are re-examining sources old and recently discovered, including the New Testament itself. Faithful scholars are in a position to clarify the historical context and the linguistic nuances of the biblical text. Current LDS scholars, working from within the framework of the doctrinal standard established by past and present church authorities who have written about the life and ministry of Jesus Christ, are attempting to provide additional historical and cultural context inside the parameters established by these authorized servants of God. Sometimes in class, students are resistant to new ideas or new ways of reading a text because of past books. Sometimes our students are resistant to these discussions that go beyond some previously published works, especially the works that have become classics in the truest sense. Some classics, such as David Copperfield, should never be updated. Other classics that deal with history or science or biblical studies should probably be updated if new information comes to light. One example of such a classic is Jesus the Christ. Now, I speak with fear and trembling because of the great reverence I have for apostolic witnesses. Because of a book that changed my life. Nevertheless, I must speak. We should hold a great reverence and even awe when approaching this sacred text. We should especially appreciate Elder Talmage's use of language and testimony. Yet we should provide a context to our discussion in the light of newly discovered historical, cultural, and language insights. Elder Talmage, whose language and sensitivity in describing the life of Christ may never be surpassed, has provided one of the most important books, a classic from which current LDS scholars often commenced. Jesus the Christ, a classic in the truest sense, continues to play a significant role in the lives of those who seek to understand the life of the Master. However, Elder Talmage did not have access to the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible or to the Dead Sea Scrolls, both of which open new windows of understanding on the world of the first century and on the prophet Joseph Smith's doctrinal contributions about the text itself. If Elder Talmage were alive today and had an opportunity to update his marvelous prose based on the fact that he carefully studied and quoted from non-Latter-day Saint scholars of his day, he would most likely take advantage of the additional light and knowledge God has revealed through various means, including the remarkable discoveries dealing directly with the New Testament text and the world of Jesus. The context of our discussion will be enhanced by a brief review of what LDS, the Bible Dictionary, says about scholarship, past and present. It is not intended as an official or revealed endorsement by the Church of the doctrinal, historical, cultural, and other matters set forth. Many of the items have been drawn from the best available scholarship of the world and are subject to reevaluation based on new research and discoveries or on new revelation. This is true of all books written by LDS scholars. The bad idea number 8. The Joseph Smith translation, of course you can see here, this is tongue-in-cheek, is only a footnote to the King James Version of the text. Certainly there are footnotes in our Bible that have the JST. The prophet's work on the new translation began in June 1830 and proceeded through 1833 when he finished his work on the Bible, at least the major effort. Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery purchased a large family or pulpit-style Bible in 1829. The edition of the KJV included the Old Testament, the Apocrypha, and the New Testament. One important JST scholar in the church today, Kent Jackson, has described the prophet's effort as a careful reading of the Bible to revise and make corrections to it as prompted by revelation. The significance of the Joseph Smith effort to translate the Bible for himself and the church cannot fully be discussed in this setting. It's simply immense. One historian captures the importance of the new translation when he compared the prophet's effort with academic translations that require language skills, dictionaries, and ancient texts. Unlike the scholarly translators, Joseph Smith went back beyond the existing text to the minds of the prophets, and through them to the mind of God. We owe much, an immense debt, to several people and groups who have preserved the JST and provided important studies on the JST and printings of the prophet's work. Foremost among the LDS Latter-day Saints to which we must owe gratitude is Robert J. Matthews, who pioneered the effort to make the JST known among church members. He casts a long shadow across the theological landscape of the Latter-day Saints. Two giants, though, Scott Farling and Kent Jackson, stand in that shadow and continue to make enduring contributions to our understanding of the importance of the prophet's works, which he described as a branch of his calling. In 1996, Brigham Young University's Religious Studies Center began the lengthy process of preparing for publication a transcription of the original manuscripts of the JST. The result is a groundbreaking 851-page volume that preserves for us as accurately as humanly possible what the prophet originally wrote. Based on the pioneering work of Scott Farling, Kent Jackson, and Robert J. Matthews, BYU professor Thomas Wayment has provided the most correct and handy comparative edition of the JST New Testament available to date. This is an important contribution to any New Testament study. I do not want to end our discussion and time together on a negative note, for I believe firmly that the glass is not half empty, but is in fact half full. This is the best time to be alive. During the time of increased media attention to the life and ministry of Jesus Christ, the New Testament, and the history of the early Christian movement, Latter-day Saints have much to be grateful for as we reflect upon what the Lord has done and what he continues to do amongst us. We are blessed with a better understanding of his glorious gospel through divine witnesses of his ministry, modern prophets and apostles who testify of his continuing presence in the church and in the world. We also benefit from the effort of faithful scholars to provide us a rich context for the good news. Let's examine together the good news about the good news. First, some of those who met Jesus along the way decided to write down what he said and did. That's good news. Two, some of the early Christians collected the writings of the New Testament during a critical period when they could have been lost. That's good news. The early church decided to preserve the books that now contained in the New Testament. They did a very good job. The early Christian church decided not to include the books that compose the New Testament Apocrypha. Professor Wayment provides a trenchant assessment of this important point. It is safe to say, based on current research, that every apocryphal text that claims to preserve the teachings of a New Testament figure was forged. The same cannot be said of the canonical Gospels, which indicates that the early Christian church was quite successful at separating the wheat from the chaff. At the same time, however, the apocryphal literature can inform us about the developments of the church in the post-apostolic period. 5, Catholic monks copied New Testament manuscripts, preserving the text for future generations. In my own way, from time to time, as I pass a Catholic church or a monastery, I say a little prayer, thanking God for these dedicated Catholic monks who spent their lives, wore out pens and dried up inkwells to copy texts you and I consider to be sacred and important. Martin Luther, William Tyndale, and others learned biblical languages, Hebrew and Greek, so they could translate the Bible because they knew that the Bible was more authoritative in the original languages than in any translation. 7, the 1611 King James Version was translated by scholars with remarkable skills, including the knowledge of Hebrew and Greek, producing an important English version of the Bible that would influence the Restoration. Protestant translators and publishers dedicated their lives to making the Bible available to the whole world. The story of the translators and publishers of the English Bible is remarkable. God's fingerprints are seen everywhere in this story. The best book on the history of the English Bible to date is this one, published several years ago, The Bible in English, printed in 2003. Archaeological advances, including the discovery of early New Testament manuscripts, provide scholars better sources than we had a century ago to help us reconstruct the world of Jesus and the apostles. 10, God called Joseph Smith and his prophetic successors to speak again in the name of the Lord, providing prophetic insight and application to the New Testament. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints promotes education of both the spirit and the mind, including the study of ancient history and biblical languages. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints released in 1979 an edition of the King James Version with important Bible helps, Greek and Hebrew alternative translations, explanation of idioms and difficult constructions, the inclusion of the Joseph Smith translation material in footnotes and appendix, the Bible dictionary, and the topical guide. These examples show some of those helps in the footnotes. Notice some of them are Greek. Here's a Greek word. Here's a better translation or an alternative translation. Here are also archaic words to try to make sense of. And so this 1979 edition is good news. My final good news about the good news is based on it's not my final good news. One of my final good news is based on my personal assessment about the lives and contribution of an increasing number of scholar disciples I have met along my own journey of discovery. Colleagues who are making a difference now because they can and because they want to do so. The Lord is pouring out his Spirit, touching the hearts of many Latter-day Saints to pursue degrees in ancient history and biblical languages. Their works help us to have a deeper appreciation for the stories that matter most, the life and ministry of God's unique Son. But the best news of all, I reserve for the last. 3 alternative translation. The first comes from King James Version, Galatians chapter 4, verse 4. But when the fullness of time was come, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman. The NIV says, but when the time had fully come, God sent his Son, born of a woman. And today's New International Version, but when the set time had fully come, God sent his Son, born of a woman. The best news about the good news is that at the very right moment, not a year too early, not a year too late, but at the very moment, God sent his Son, born of a woman. Of course, that he was sent before he was born fits in with our idea that he had been chosen before the foundation of the world to be the lamb sacrificed. In most likely what is a pre-Pauline formula. In other words, something that was in the early church that Paul simply copied into this very early letter of Galatians. We have a chiasm that sets the point. First, God sent his Son. Second, made under the law. Third, to redeem them that were under the law. Fourth, that we might receive the adoptions of sons. Prophetic counsel about the New Testament that we're talking about today and we spoke about yesterday. President Hinckley has said, the Bible is a marvelous book. I wish everyone would read the Bible more. We would all profit if we would read the 4 Gospels concerning the Lord and his ministry. It is a marvelous book. The Bible is the testament of the old world. The Book of Mormon is the testament of the new world, and they have come together as 2 witnesses, not only one, but as 2 witnesses of the divinity of the Son of God. So we end our story where we began nearly 2,000 years ago. In the land where Jesus of Nazareth walked and talked about the good news. One of his disciples who walked with him, who witnessed the miracle of his life, his death, and his resurrection, left his own witness, his testimony, in the form of a book we now call the Gospel of John. As he concluded his story of the Lamb of God, John testified, but these things are written that ye might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing ye might have life through his name. We stand as his witnesses, scholar disciples, and as dedicated disciples of Jesus Christ, living at a time when marvelous light has been shed on the earth. We know and we testify that God has sent his Son to rescue a fallen creation, and that through Jesus Christ's saving atonement 2,000 years ago, a door has been swung open, and you and I have been invited, nay, we have been commanded to walk through it into his marvelous light in the name of Jesus Christ, the focus of the New Testament. In his name, amen.
For more information on this Sperry Symposium address, visit our website at byubroadcasting.org. This Sidney B. Sperry Symposium address by Dr. Richard Neitzel Holzapfel was given on October 28, 2006. Funding for this program was provided in part by BYU Religious Education and the Religious Studies Center.